So we're going to talk today about microtomy, and it's one of the most important technical skills that's performed in clinical and research histopathology labs. And you'll notice skills is in italics and highlighted in blue because it truly is a skill. I don't know if you've worked with people who don't have that skill, but you either have it or you don't. And it's something that you can perfect over the years, but if you don't have that skill going into it, it's really difficult. So just know how skilled you are when you're sitting at a microtome. Okay, I always consider microtomy a pivotal point, and that's because everything that happens to the specimen before it gets to the microtome affects the way it sections. And if it doesn't section well, the quality of the routine, special, and advanced staining will be compromised. As we all know, that this will affect the accuracy of the final diagnosis too, and that's something that we certainly don't want. So it's a pivotal point. You have to do everything right before it gets to the microtome. If everything isn't right, it won't look good from that point on. So how do you get a quality section? Well, you have to have a specimen that's been properly fixed, processed, and embedded. You need a highly skilled operator. That's our word again, skill. You need to select and use the proper microtome knife or disposable blade, and you have to maintain those things impeccably. You have to take care of the things that can give you the good section. So what can make the difference? Have you ever heard the term garbage in, garbage out? If they give you something that's garbage to put on your processor and embed and section, what will you give back to them? Garbage, right? So, by the way, please inform the grossing staff that this is not what you had in mind. This is an actual specimen that was submitted to a lab to process. And your first indication that something is wrong is the rubber band that's trying to secure the lid on the cassette. Obviously, they've put too much tissue inside the cassette. The second big problem is they've used the wrong type of cassette for that size tissue. Even if it did fit, it would still be the wrong type of cassette because that's actually a biopsy cassette. It has small holes, so your fluid exchange would be compromised. And when you've got a big specimen, you need big slots or holes so that you can get the proper fluid exchange. So let's talk a little bit about fixation. It is the very most important step in histotechnology. It's also the most misunderstood and ignored. So what does chemical fixation do? And that's what we're doing when we fix with formalin. It stabilizes the proteins. It maintains the relationships between cells and extracellular substances. It changes soluble substances within the cell to insoluble substances so they don't wash away as you're processing. It prevents postmortem changes like autolysis and putrefaction. It gives you some contrast. That's why we put things in formalin so we can find lymph nodes. It gives you contrast so you can see things. But the most important thing, and this is a direct quote from a good friend of mine, Dr. Dick Dapson, who's retired now from Anatech, and it was one of his brilliant workshops that I attended where I heard this. It protects the specimen from the ravages of tissue processing. And you can imagine taking a piece of tissue that's in an aqueous environment in the body with controlled temperature and placing it in all of these solutions, exposing it to heat, forcing solutions in, some of them with very large molecular structures like paraffin. So it really is ravaging to the tissue. If it's properly fixed, it's less ravaging. So when you're fixing with formalin, these are some of the things you need to consider. You should have a 20-to-1 relationship or ratio between your fixative and your specimen. That's what's optimum. You can get by with 15-to-1, but it's not as nice. And you need to remember that the concentration of the solution will vary because you're diluting it with the water that's in the tissue, and you're depleting it because the formalin molecules will actually attach and bind to the macromolecules in the tissue and the tissue proteins. Specimen size is important. The thickness should be no more than 4 millimeters. If you've got large pieces of tissue in the gross room, you need to bread loaf them, and you need to bisect encapsulated specimens, things like cysts and lymph nodes. So the formalin has a chance to get into the part that you really care about and want to preserve immediately. Fixation time is critical, and it's a very essential element in handling the tissue. You have to allow time for cross-linking to occur. And this is something that everyone speeds through because they want to get the tissue out quickly. But it takes about 24 to 48 hours to properly fix and cross-link a piece of tissue that's about 4 millimeters thick. And I know none of you have that time, but there are ways to speed it up. That's another workshop, and we can do that at a later time. You also need to adhere to the regulations for specific specimens like your breast tissue. Here's some rules to live by as far as processing goes. Specimens that are either over-processed or under-processed will not section well. That's the bottom line. Using standard paraffin processing techniques, it is impossible to get optimum processing on all specimens of all sizes unless they're segregated by size and or type. So basically what this means is if you use one processing program and you put all of the tissues on the same processing program at the same time, your biopsies are going to cut poorly because they're going to be over-desiccated. You'll have to soak them before you can section them, and your large pieces of tissue will be under-processed, and there'll be what I like to call a ring around the section. You get the outer ring that has been fixed and has processed, but the inside is all mush and you can't cut it. So the things that you care the very least about, like the appendices and maybe a gallbladder or a tonsil that are kind of a medium size, will process well. But the things that you care the most about, like the biopsies and your diagnostic tissues, won't process well. So you need to segregate those specimens, use multiple programs, even multiple processors if you need to. Some of the factors that can affect the specimen during processing are the use of heat, vacuum, and pressure, the types of reagents that you use and their strength. Going along with that is the number of steps and the duration of the exposure and the cleanliness of the reagents. Another thing you need to think about is if you use sponges, paper, or biopsy cassettes, because those have a tendency to carry solutions from one container to another. In your picture that you'll see there, I took 2 sponges and exposed them to formalin. I wrung them out on the piece of lens paper that's sitting there, and it's about 2 milliliters of solution that's carried over in those 2 sponges. So if you stop and think about it, if you've got 300 cassettes that have 2 sponges in each one, you're carrying about 600 milliliters of solution from one container to the next. And you're getting a lot of carryover, and that can cause problems if you're not paying attention to the cleanliness of your solutions. So just little things to think about. Dehydration. This is something that we really need to understand. The key to proper dehydration is to expose the specimen long enough to remove the free water molecules, but not so long that you remove the bound water. The bound water separates and isolates the macromolecules. If you remove it, you get conformational changes, and that causes shrinking and hard, brittle tissue. That's not what you want. Xylenes are a typical clearing agent. I think it's what most people use. They're an aromatic hydrocarbon. They can also remove bound water. So if you've overexposed the tissue in the alcohols, the high concentrations of alcohols, and then you overexpose in xylene, you're going to get brittle tissue. The xylene substitutes are less aggressive, and there's two types that you typically see. That's the limonene derivatives that have that slight citrus smell, and then the aliphatic hydrocarbons, usually short change. The thing you have to remember with those is they're completely intolerant of water. So if you come out of an alcohol that's not an absolute alcohol and go into one of the aliphatic hydrocarbons, you will not get good process. Paraffin, if you're using it as your infiltration medium during routine processing, that last station has to be free of contamination. You can enhance the infiltration by using vacuum, but you have to be really careful if you've got small, fragile biopsies. And you need to limit the exposure to reduce shrinking and hardening of tissue. Embedding. This is another thing that has to be done correctly before you get to the microtome. Aside from selecting the proper paraffin, there's two other considerations that you need to think about when you're embedding, and that's the temperature of absolutely everything. Your forceps, your mold, your tissue, the paraffin that's being put in, how long it takes you to get the specimen into the paraffin. Because if it's not the right temperature, the two paraffins, the one you're adding and the one that's surrounding the tissue, will not form a bond, and you'll get a very poor sectioning because you won't have a cohesive layer. You'll have the tissue, and then you'll have the embedding paraffin, and they are not attached. Orientation is the other thing when you're embedding. When you embed, you have to think ahead of time. How is this tissue going to hit the blade? If it's not angled correctly or placed correctly, it can be a real problem when you get to the microtome. So these are things you have to worry about when you're embedding. So finally, let's start talking about the microtomes. Almost everyone in the U.S. uses rotary microtomes, and they call them rotary microtomes because when you rotate the fine advance hand wheel 360 degrees, and you'll see the arrow pointing to that hand wheel, it moves the specimen vertically past the cutting surface and then returns it to the starting position. Now this can either be done manually or electronically, either one. There's two types of microtomes that are available. This is a non-retracting microtome, so let me show you how that works. You'll see the specimen in the paraffin block, and you see the blue, kind of an aqua-colored triangular piece that depicts the knife. And on a non-retracting microtome, the specimen comes down to the bottom of the stroke and goes up in exactly the same plane. So when it comes down, it cuts the section. When it comes up again, it's actually rubbing against the tip of the blade. All right, so that's a non-retracting microtome. Those are the ones that are from my generation, like the AO820s, the Lights 1512s. Some of the newer microtomes you can turn the retraction off, but I certainly wouldn't recommend that. Now let me show you what a retracting microtome does, and this is a little bit exaggerated. Same specimen block, same blade. So it comes down. When it gets to the bottom of the stroke, it moves away from the blade edge for the upstroke. When it gets to the top of the stroke, it moves forward whatever it retracted plus whatever you've told it you want to section. So if it's got a 20 micron retraction and you want to cut it 4, the specimen would drop down. When it gets to the bottom of the stroke, it would move back 20 microns, come up to the top of the stroke, and move forward 24. So that's a retracting microtome. That's a really important feature for many reasons, mostly because when you contact the blade with the block on the downstroke and the upstroke, you're creating friction. Friction creates heat. Heat on paraffin creates expansion, correct? So as you're trimming and as you're sectioning, you're getting a buildup of debris on the back of the blade edge. And that's something you have to reach around and scrape off, and that's not where you want your hands. So that's one thing. You'll also improve the longevity of the blade itself. So there's a lot of good reasons that you want retracting microtomes. All right, so options for operation on microtomes these days. Manual microtomes where there's absolutely no motorized features. Everything is dependent upon the operator. You've got semi-motorized where there's one motor drive, and that motor will either operate the coarse advance of the specimen toward or away from the blade edge, or the fine advance hand wheel, depending on the model of microtome. Fully motorized microtomes have two motor drives that operate both the coarse advance and the fine advance, where you're actually having your sectioning stroke. There's something new on the market. I don't know if you've seen it or not, but it's made by Sakura, and it's the Tissue Tech Auto Section. It's a fully automated instrument with auto alignment. And you'll see a picture on the right bottom corner. Let me see if I can do this. Right here. This is the block face, and it's going to actually press against this plate right here. This plate is movable, and that sits on the back of the blade holder. This is the blade holder here. So when you activate the auto alignment, the specimen head drops down, the block is pressed against this plate until 4 contact points are reached, and then it knows how the block face can be presented to the blade edge so that you get full sections immediately. And it eliminates the manual XY orientation of the block. So this is something new that's on the market. Okay, disposable blades. Let's talk a little bit about those. Some tips for good sectioning. You need to section at a slow to moderate pace, not fast. Disposable blades can't always handle extremely hard specimens. That's something you need to be aware of. If you've got a bone that is not properly decalcified, it might be too hard for a disposable blade, and you might need to go to a reusable knife. Once you set up chatter in a blade and a block, it's really hard to get rid of it. So you want to eliminate all the ways you can start the chatter. And sometimes it happens because you're presenting something that's too hard or you're turning the wheel too fast. As far as the clamping plate that actually holds the disposable blade, you need to be sure that the front and the back surfaces are clean and defect-free. So if you inadvertently cut the tip of your forceps or get some defect from dropping the blade holder, you need to have that blade holder clamping plate replaced. Because once there's a defect, if it presses on the blade, it will actually distort the blade edge. If you have an instrument that will allow you to over-tighten the blade, you need to be aware of that and not over-tighten. You just want enough pressure to stabilize the blade and support it in the blade holder. Now let's talk about the thing that everyone worries about, and that's the clearance angle. This is a drawing that shows the clearance angle, and it's the distance between the lower facet angle and the surface of the block face. So if you draw a line like the large red line from the back side of the beveled portion of the blade, and you draw that down at the angle that is presented to the block at, and then you see the block face, that is the clearance angle. If it's not adjusted correctly and you tip the blade too much toward yourself, away from the block, when it comes down, the block can actually rub against the back of that beveled blade edge, right? If you tip it too far the other way, the block can actually bend the blade as it's cutting, and you will not get good sections. So if you have an instrument that allows you to adjust the angle, don't be afraid to adjust it and optimize it for that particular microtome and that particular blade that you're using. And be aware that manufacturers use different angle markings on their microtomes. Some of the manufacturers build in angles on their knife holder bases and some don't. So if you've got two different brands of microtome, you cannot set them at the same angle. You have to figure it out for that particular microtome. Some of the microtomes now have fixed angles, like the auto section, and it's optimized for that instrument. And that's kind of a nice way to go so that you don't have to worry about trying to get the right angle. It's already been set for you. And now we'll talk about the micrometer setting. This is kind of like your holiday wish list. What you put down on paper or dial into this micrometer setting is not always what you will get. It's a wish list. It's what you want, but it doesn't guarantee that each section will be that exact thickness. I'm sure you've all seen thick and thin sections. So the thickness depends on a lot of outside influence, like how was the tissue processed? How was it fixed? What's the temperature of the block? What's the temperature of the room? Is your blade sharp? Does it have defects? Is it angled correctly? What's your cutting speed? All of these things can affect the thickness. So microtomes are checked. They're calibrated at the factory when they're made, and then they're checked repeatedly before they're sent out. If there's a problem in the field, then people can test them right in your lab. They have to take off the block holder, and they attach a block and a gauge to your specimen arm. And as the fine advanced hand wheel is rotated, there is a pin that rests against the microtome, and it measures how far the specimen arm is advancing, and it's seen on that gauge. And typically, it's not the microtome when you're getting thick and thin sections. It's something else. It's either an accessory or it's something that we just discussed, temperature, quality of the processing, whatever. But this way they can tell whether it's the microtome or not. Block placement is another thing that you need to think about. Remember that the cutting force comes from the bottom of the block. If you position the block in the specimen holder in a vertical orientation, you need to think about what type of cassette you're using. Because if you've got a cassette where you tear off the lid and it leaves little pieces of plastic that extend out, you're probably not getting a really good hold on the bottom of the block. And the other part that's holding it is the top of the block, and as you can see on this block, it also is not straight. So if I were using this particular cassette, I would place my cassettes horizontally. If you've got a cassette that does not have those uneven surfaces, you can place it horizontally or vertically and it won't matter. If you have trouble sectioning, one of the things that I've often done, if I can't get a good section in the orientation that I have the block in, I'll flip it 90 degrees and see if I can get a better section there. Trimming. Aggressive trimming produces a moth hole effect on the section. So if you're trimming and you get sections that look like the one that's sitting on the gauze, the bottom of the gauze in a very tight roll, you're probably trimming too thick. And what you're doing is basically ripping the cells out of the cells off of the cell wall, and you're going to have moth holes. It's going to look terrible. So your trimming thickness should be no more than about 20 to 30 microns. If you've got hard tissue, you need to trim thinner, or you're going to chunk it out of the block, and you need to trim slowly. So if you're going fast and you've got something hard and you're taking very aggressive sections, you're going to lose your tissue. Soaking the block. A lot of people trim their blocks and then soak them in a little bit water, and that's probably because they're over-desiccated. So if you fix and process correctly, you don't really need to soak your block. If you're really good and do a really good job, you don't even need to ice your block. So if you've over-desiccated, you might want to place it on a little water so you can restore some of that moisture, put some of the bound water back, or what it thinks is bound water, and you'll get some good sections for the first few sections at least. If you extend the soaking for some reason, you're going to cause expansion of the tissue, and it will actually expand out of the paraffin. And when you start to trim, you're going to lose that tissue, which is just criminal. It just shouldn't happen. What you're doing is expanding the tissue, cutting it off, and it's going to be in your waste tray. And that's certainly not what you want. And most people find that they need to soak their biopsies, and that's certainly not what you want on your biopsies. So go back, if you've got tissue that's over-desiccated, think through how you can keep from doing that in your processing. And maybe you can cut down on some of this soaking that's necessary. Sectioning speed is also a consideration. The rate at which sections are cut directly affect their thickness. The faster you go, the more friction you'll generate, and you'll get thicker sections. If you don't believe me, there's an easy way to figure this out. Cut a section at a very moderate speed and put it on the slide. Cut one at a very fast speed and put it on the slide. Stain them together. Look under the microscope and see if you can see a difference in the thickness. And you'll be able to do that by focusing up and down and seeing more than one cell layer. So it's very easy to figure out. Temperature of the room and the block are very important. A cool room is ideal for sectioning, but sometimes they're hard to come by. I live in Texas, and when I first started my training, I worked at Parkland Hospital in Dallas, and we did not have air conditioning. So you can imagine the summertime in Dallas with paraffin blocks. It was not pretty. So the optimum block temperature depends on processing quality, embedding media, and the tissue type. It's going to change. Some things cut better colder, and those are usually the ones that are very hard. And then your soft tissue cuts better at a little warmer temperature. Chilling the blocks gives your tissue and your wax a more homogeneous quality, so it's like cutting the same consistency. If you've got something soft in a hard embedding paraffin, then a little bit of warm water can soften the consistency of the specimen and the wax and make it a little more homogeneous that way. Static electricity is a big problem, especially in the winter time, and you can reduce that by boiling some water in the room, adding a little humidity. You can get a humidifier, or even easier, you can take a dryer sheet and place it behind your disposable blade holder or knife holder, and that helps cut down on the static also. Cleanliness, it cannot be overemphasized. You need to make sure that your microtome, your accessories, the knife or blade, and the work area are clean. If you've used any acid for surface decalcification, you need to be sure to rinse your blocks before you put them in the blade holder or the block holder and drip that onto the blade holder. So that needs to be a consideration, but you also need to remove any debris and any water, because even though these things are made of high quality materials, they can still be affected by acids and by water. And debris is just a source of contamination. So the knife and blade and the block holders should not be cleaned with a hydrocarbon-based paraffin solvent, because what you can do is make a very sticky mess. What I usually recommend is that people remove these things and place them in the oven for a short period of time so the paraffin will melt. You could also use a hair dryer or something to help melt the paraffin. Anything that is not a hydrocarbon-based paraffin solvent would be preferable. So let's talk a little bit about ergonomics, because that is a big issue with microtomy. It provides a good way. If you're using the proper ergonomics, you will not develop musculoskeletal disorders. If you are doing microtomy manually and incorrectly, it will eventually lead to the development of musculoskeletal disorders. Automation will reduce those repetitive motions that contribute to MSDs. So this is one part of your laboratory work that has been automated well, and if it were me, I would never go back to a manual microtome. I would always use automation. Not only does it save you from doing these repetitive motions, but it also provides a lot of consistency. And once you start using an automated instrument, you'll see that. You'll get very consistent, beautiful sections. So correct working postures. You need to have an awareness of your comfort zone or your reach zone. And that's the area right in front of you where you are the strongest. You have the best dexterity. You have the best visual acuity. You can see well. And you can work in neutral postures, meaning that you don't have flex of any of the joints. Neutral postures are very important. So this is your horizontal reach zone, and you can see zone 1, 2, 3, and 4. Of course, your fine work needs to be done directly in front of you in zone 1. And you'll notice if you're working there on your microtome, nothing in zone 1 would accommodate your water bath. So keep that in mind as we go along. So as you go further out, zone 2, 3, and 4, you'll notice that those are for things that are used less often or very rarely. This is your vertical reach zone. Again, you want it to be in zone 1 or zone 2, not zone 3. Those are things that need to be things that you would get up to reach and use. So this is a depiction of a neutral wrist posture, meaning that there's no flexation up or down. It's a neutral wrist, straight out from the elbow, through the wrist, through the fingers, and you can either use it with your palm facing down or facing in. That's the midpoint of your range of motion. So how can you translate that to microtomy? Well, if necessary, if you've got a microtome that is manual, that you have to turn with a handle, and the handle is too small, then you can do something to correct that. You can put a tennis ball, a racket ball, have your people in your shop create something like they did here, to where you can grasp it and keep your hand in a neutral position. You'll notice I got a little excited here in dark blue letters that are all capitalized. I said, do not rock the hand wheel. It will not hurt the microtome, but it will hurt you. What you're doing is rocking up and down with your wrist, and that is bad. It will eventually lead to carpal tunnel. So you need to make complete revolutions using a neutral wrist position, and don't extend your arm out of your comfort zone. Some of the ergonomic suggestions, you'll notice that I told you to kind of remember about the reach zone and your water bath. And the water bath does not fit on that reach zone. So what you end up doing is leaning from the waist over to the side to lay out your ribbon. So if you could position that water bath on an L-shaped extension, that would allow you to have a lot more ease on your back and hopefully not go home at night with a backache. You need to keep your arms close to your body and off of the hard surfaces. Keep your neck and shoulders relaxed. Take scheduled mini breaks, including brief exercises, to help restore your circulation and relieve tension. And I can see your faces now. You're thinking that crazy lady is telling me to take mini breaks when I'm so busy I can't even turn around. But this will prepare you to productively work the rest of the day. So if you allow your body to recover every now and then, like every hour, take a minute or 2 minutes just to do a little exercise to get rid of this tension, you'd be amazed at how much better you will work for the remaining hour. Again, use automation whenever possible so you can minimize repetitive motion. Get an ergonomic chair. I know that ergonomic chairs are not cheap, but they're a lot less expensive than having a workman's comp claim. You need to adjust the chair so that you can reach the hand wheels comfortably and not compromise your leg room. And if you're vertically challenged, you need to use a footrest. What causes artifacts? We're not going to have time to go through absolutely every one of these, but we'll hit the main ones. The vertical knife marks and split sections are usually caused by calcium or some hard particle. They can also be caused by buffer salts that have precipitated in the tissue. And this can happen if you're coming out of 10% neutral buffered formalin and don't go into an alcohol that's 70% or less. Those buffer salts will precipitate out. You might have dirty paraffin. There's a filter on the paraffin dispenser, and you need to be sure it's in place and checked, because paraffin is dirty. It's inherently dirty, and if little particles of dirt get into the paraffin, then it will create difficulties when you're cutting. You could have a dirty or a damaged knife edge, or you could be scraping instead of cutting. Remember when we were talking about the angle, if you tip the blade to where it can hit the back of the beveled portion, you're actually scraping the block. So you'd want to reduce your knife tilt. Compression is another big one. That can be caused by a dull blade. If that's the case, you need to change that blade immediately, and you might even have to go to a different number of blades. Your block could be too warm. You could have an incorrect angle. It'll also happen if you're cutting too fast, so you need to slow down. And it can also be that your paraffin is contaminated, not dirty. Thick and thin sections, this is probably the very most common cutting artifact. Something could be loose, your angle could be incorrect, your specimen could be too large or too hard, and the blade just can't handle it. Your specimen orientation might be off, and what that means is during embedding. So if you present a really hard piece of tissue and it's long on one side, and you hit that long side, that can cause thick and thin sections. You need to re-embed it and put it at an angle so you're only hitting part of that long, hard surface at a time. You could be sectioning too fast, you could have poor tension on the blade, or you could have a microtome malfunction. It's rare, but it's not impossible. Chatter marks could be from overprocessed tissue, a dull knife, or incorrect knife angle. Venetian blinds, that's just chatter at a different frequency. It could be that your specimen's too large or too hard. You've got a poorly clamped knife or blade. It could be a microtome malfunction, or it could be an incorrect angle. If you don't get a ribbon, it could be a dull knife, it could be the room temperature, it could also be the coating on the blade. So if that happens, you might want to just rub some alcohol-soaked gauze very carefully over your blade edge and remove a little bit of the coating, or cut a blank block first. A lot of times when it's the coating, you'll see each section curl, and it won't adhere to the next section and form a ribbon. So sometimes the coating is applied a little bit too thick, and it's not caught in QC, so that's something you can try. could be that your paraffin is too hard. When you're using your paraffin dispenser on your embedding instrument, you need to stir that paraffin in the morning, especially if you turn that portion of the machine off and let it solidify overnight, because these different constituents in the paraffin will come out of solution and at different rates as it's warming. So you could have a lot of polymer that goes down to the bottom and you get a block that's really, really hard. So stir your paraffin, make sure it's nicely mixed and everything is melted. That's another big thing, and then go from there. Let's scoot along here. Crooked ribbons that the top and the bottom edges are not even with the cutting edge, or you could have an uneven clamp on your blade. That's probably the one that's the most common. So make sure that the back side of your clamping plate is clean, and make sure that you've got even pressure all along the blade edge. If you hear a singing or ringing noise during sectioning, that's bad. All the music should be on your radio, not your microtome. So the specimen's too large, too hard, you're cutting too fast, or you've got a bad angle. These I think you can just read on your own. I want to leave time for any questions. So let's get to the conclusion. Microtomy is the true melding of science and art. Sectioning depends on science. There is a plethora of scientific technique that leads up to the microtomy step, and you have to execute it perfectly to achieve quality section. Sectioning is also artistic. So we've got our science and we've got our art. The reason it's artistic is because it's so highly reliant upon the operator's senses, skills, and talent. And that's you. You need to be the one that provides the artistic quality to this. You also need to know the science so that what you've brought to the microtome is beautiful when it leaves the microtome. And that's the end.